Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Dan Pierce and I'm one of the founders of Mentally Fit. We have another great talk for you today. And today our guest is David Kadavy. He is an author, a best-selling author, whose books have helped people be more creative and productive when that really matters. He was the design advisor for behavioral scientist Dan Ariely's productivity app, Timeful. And his method was actually used to inform the features, some of the features in Google Calendar. So you've probably seen his work somewhere out there in the wild. David, thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited to talk to you.
Dan, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah, so we were just chatting a little bit before we got on, and one of the things that somebody said was that time seems to be speeding up right now that the pandemic is kind of, or things are opening up a little bit, the pandemic is slowing. And whereas last year felt like the longest year ever, the last month has felt like the fastest month ever. What has your experience been like with that?
My experience, I mean, as far as time perception goes, my experience hasn't changed a whole lot because I have kind of designed my lifestyle around having a pretty predictable routine, being at home a lot of the time, and really making creative output my main focus. It's been a kind of a long project that we can get into if you want, but basically I live in Medellin, Colombia. I live in South America, and I moved here in part to redesign my life so that I could optimize my creative output. So actually, every day I kind of make every day the same anyway, and my weeks, and we can get into all that stuff. But I kind of follow a routine anyway, so it hasn't actually changed my time perception a great amount, other than that maybe I'm getting a little bit more work done because now I don't. I guess I don't feel the pressure to go out and do anything because you just can't.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I know a lot of, so we're here specifically to talk about how to help therapists to manage their time. Because I know a lot of therapists in our community at Mentally Fit, they are struggling with overwhelm, compassion fatigue, and above all else, I think a sense of burnout. So it's that feeling, I'm sure everyone here has experienced it to some degree, that sense of feeling like completely overwhelmed and just like out of gas. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with time management. Can you speak to that, how time management plays into the experience of burnout and what you might be able to do about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're doing emotional labor or mental labor, you have to think about things completely differently, because time management, it's very easy for us to lose sight of the fact that it's a new concept to us. Like, we didn't really know what time it was for much of human history. Like, if you were gonna have an appointment with somebody, it had to be at like sunup or sundown, because that was kind of the only time that you could say there was an event happening. And now we have things synchronized to down to the second or the minute, where like you're waiting for your friend to show up at the coffee shop and it's like, oh, it's 2:01 right now. Where are you at? Like, you're late. And so things are synced a lot. And our conception of time management originated with the Industrial Revolution, with Frederick Taylor, basically with a stopwatch, standing next to a worker. In his first case, it was moving chunks of environment. You could say stacking bricks as an example, and just breaking down every single motion that had to happen in order to complete that job. Was, okay, hold this thing in this way, turn in this way, bend in this way, and you're going to complete this job, and this is the most efficient way to complete that. Now, that doesn't really take into account so much the limits of the human mind. There were considerations over the limits of the human body here and there, but when it comes to creative work, it's a completely different thing. It is not a procedural step-by-step thing. I'm speaking about creativity, but this could be about decision making, or just being in that state of mind where you're focused, where you're able to make clear decisions, where you're able to take in new information and learn and process it well. And if you're burned out, then you're not really in that state. So you kind of have to think about things in a different way, and you can start to notice some kind of rhythms and patterns that allow you to get into a certain state. I think of it more in terms of creativity. There's this great quote by the sculptor Konstantin Brancusi, who said, "Things are not so difficult to make. What is difficult is getting ourselves in the state of mind to make them." And that's something that I experienced, which actually, this is how I ended up on the journey that culminated in writing this book, was when I got my first book deal, roughly 10, 11 years ago. I wrote a book about design, and I already had lots of experience as a designer and solving creative problems and sort of getting to those blocks where you're not able to mentally make happen the thing that you're trying to make happen. But suddenly I had this book deal. I had to write a book in 6 months. Didn't have a lot of experience as a writer. Thought I would be able to handle it. Turned out it wasn't so easy. And so I was banging my head against the wall 12 hours a day. But then I would suddenly get these moments where I would just hit this vein. Like within 15 minutes, I'd get in the flow, and within like 15 minutes, I'd have an entire chapter drafted. And so I'd say to myself, well, if I had to bang my head against the wall for 12 hours just to get this 15 minutes done, why couldn't I just do the 15 minutes and then get on with the rest of my day? And so that's where I started to get really fascinated with this idea of, well, how do we get into the right state to do this thing that we're trying to do? And also, are there any predictable patterns in that we can then manage and arrange so that we are more efficiently doing that mental labor, where it does become almost like you're doing procedural work, like stacking bricks, because you have things arranged so well. But what most of us are doing is we are trying to look at things like it's okay, do this thing, I need to do this thing, and it's a step-by-step thing, when in fact, you sometimes have to create those conditions to even be able to do the thing that you're trying to do. So that's kind of a basic overview of the way that I look at time management, and as I think of it now, mind management.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know one thing I've heard is that, people feel like their time is going by a lot, but they're getting very little done.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that speaks to that like you can either spend a lot of time doing nothing or a little optimized time doing a lot. So what are your strategies for doing a lot in that time, as short a time as possible?
Yeah. Well, I think it all starts with, I'm going to keep going back to creativity here. And I think it's especially valuable for anybody who's trying to do any sort of thought leadership in their practice, where they're trying to write a book, they're trying to write articles, they're trying to contribute to the knowledge base in some way, and synthesize the things that they're learning and observing and share them. Because I think that's really where the mental heavy lifting happens. I mean, obviously, yeah, like you were talking about, what was the word? Empathy fatigue. I mean, that's a whole other thing as well. But I start thinking about it from the standpoint of, let's first see what sort of condition we're trying to create. So insights are the building blocks of creative thinking. And there's these two neuroscientists, John Kunyos and Mark Beeman, who have seen insights happen in the brain. There's these sort of aha moments where you go from not having a solution, you don't have a solution to this problem, and it's a creative problem, to suddenly you have this solution. And it's this flash of activity in the brain. It is, they found it to be neurologically distinct from other types of thinking that you might do if you were doing procedural work, whether it was stacking bricks or, just typing numbers into a spreadsheet. It's a completely different state that you're trying to get into. I mean, I think of it like a racquetball court with there's these blue balls bouncing all over the place, and every once in a while some of them collide. So an insight is this moment where these various regions of the brain are all kind of talking to each other at once for just a moment, and the prefrontal cortex isn't interfering as much, and so there's certain states that that help those insights happen. So if you are in a positive mood, you are in a relaxed mood, these are hard things to come by these days, you're more apt to have insights. And so, I mean, isn't that a cruel trick? If you are trying to jockey your schedule and get things to work, but then you're also trying to make creative insights happen, we're getting into an anxious state and you're not able to think clearly and have those brilliant insights. And so I start with it thinking about it that way. Then there's also this other concept in creativity that's been around for a very long time, the 4 stages of creativity, or I've modified it a little bit. Graham Wallace called it the 4 stages of thought. It was based upon a speech by Hermann von Helmholtz from the late 1800s. And it is the stages that happen for creative work to happen. So there's preparation, incubation, illumination, verification. So I won't get too deep into all those. You don't have to think about that. But the main lesson there, though, is just that sometimes we're trying to accomplish a certain thing and we're putting the cart before the horse. We're not actually ready to accomplish that thing in that moment. So like if I'm writing an article and I sit down, I'm like, all right, I'm going to write this article. And suddenly what happens? We get frustrated. We get frustrated because we can't create something up to the standards that we're trying to create it. If we type something, it turns out not quite right. And maybe we stop and we're like, well, wait, you need to look up something. You need to look up how something's spelled, what year something happened, or you don't actually know the research behind a certain thing and you need to figure out all that stuff. Well, you need to have that knowledge first before you can have that moment of illumination, that moment of insight, as Kunyos and Beeman would call it, and many cognitive scientists. You need to have the things in place for that to happen, and so a good way to think of it also is in terms of working memory and long-term memory, which it's very intimidating to say this in front of a clinical psychologist who, I know it's not necessarily that simple, working memory, long-term memory, but let's just break it down and pretend that it is exactly that simple. I mean, you can only hold so much stuff in your working memory at any given time. What is it? They say, 4 to 7 digits, something like that. And your long-term memory, like you can remember the smell of your grandmother's perfume from like 30 years ago. It's amazing the things that you can remember. And so what we often do, just using that example of, say, trying to write an article, what we usually do is we sit down and we try to think of all the things we want to say in the article. And maybe we don't even actually really know all those things like by heart yet. And we're trying to write it. And at the same time, we're trying to also like make sure it's decently edited. And it's really frustrating. And we, unsurprisingly, get very fatigued and burnt out, and we get frustrated and we get burnt out. We just abandon it. We go on to something else if we can. If it's some sort of creative thing where we're trying to do something that doesn't necessarily have to be done. And so if we can be a little bit more gentle with ourselves and understanding that we need to get to the right state to be able to make those things happen, then things become easier. It becomes easier to get in that state. So for example, with this idea of short-term memory, long-term memory, we need to take in that information and then sort of allow it to sink into the long-term memory. and then come back to it with a fresh, open long-term memory. Because what we're trying to do, if we can only do so much with that working memory, then we're like trying to grab the things that we're trying to connect, and then we're trying to connect them at the same time, and at the same time we're trying to like make sure it's well edited, for example. So, and that kind of shows you the first few stages of those 4 stages: the preparation of like doing the research, the incubation, which is allowing that stuff to sink into your long-term memory, and then the illumination, which is going back to the problem with the information well embedded into your knowledge and being able to have that insight. And then there's the verification, which might be the crossing of the I's, the crossing, you don't want to cross I's, the dotting of the I's, the crossing of the T's, the making sure things are well edited, that the prose works. And so those are all separate things. And we're too often trying to make all that stuff happen at once. Now, back to your original question, which I'm amazed that I even remember it, was basically, how do you do more work in less time? So when it comes to this sort of creative stuff, when you recognize that there are those stages to the process, then you can start to be intentional about using those stages to your advantage. One of the more powerful forces is that of incubation. If you're presented with a problem and some time passes, whether you go do something else, whether you sleep, especially if you sleep, whatever you do, whether you sit and stare at the wall, you return to that problem and you will be better at solving that problem than if you had just sat down and tried to solve it. There's that, that sort of subconscious, I call it the passive genius, that's at work. There's a few things that have been identified in the research on that. One of them is fixation forgetting. We often tend to like kind of make weak connections, and those sort of bad ideas fall away. And then we consolidate memories. We consolidate relational memory. So if I tell you that Tom is taller than Bill and that Harry's taller than Tom, I didn't tell you that Harry's taller than Bill. And this is a very basic example, but just having that incubation would help that sink into your memory so that you would be better able to attack that thing. Now, what am I getting at with this? So you can use incubation intentionally when it comes to any of these problem-solving things that you might, problem-solving, creativity, any sort of thing where there's a lot of stuff that you've got to make a lot of trade-offs and decide how to take action on this thing. Helps with decisions, for example. And we know this intuitively. There's the popular phrase to sleep on it, right? That your mind's gonna sort of take care of this problem in the interim. And so why not take advantage of that? So for myself, I do what I call taking the minimum creative dose, which is you just take in the very basic things. You could set a timer for 2 minutes if you wanted. Or let's say you're working on an article. You're just like writing the worst little outline, and maybe you're even putting in brackets in places. Well, I don't really know this part. I need to look up this. You step away from it. You come back, could be 15 minutes, could be the next day, could be the next week. Kind of depends upon the size of the creative problems that you're trying to fix, or the types of problems you're trying to fix. Well, in the interim, you have your mind has let that stuff seep in, and suddenly it's much easier. So for myself as a writer, I take advantage of that, where I have a podcast, and if I used to maybe like write my script for my podcast, I would sit down and just try to write it. Painful, not a fun experience. But if I first take notes on the conversation as I listen to it while I cook or shower, just take quick notes, or even listen to it without taking notes and then listen to it again a day later at 2x speed, suddenly I can hear things clearer. I know when the good stuff is coming, I can take the quick notes. And then a couple days later, I sit down and write a really crappy draft based on those notes. Then a couple days later, I come back and I fix the whole thing and make the script ready to go. And so now I've done, within maybe a few minutes of active work, something that used to be something that took me an hour of like cognitively heavy, painful, I do not want to do this work that I would also procrastinate on. And so I think that's one great way for us to be able to do more in less time, is to identify what is it that you're trying to do with your mind right now? And is what you're ordering from your mind a realistic thing? And if it's not a realistic thing, how can you break it down in a way that you are allowing that subconscious process, those subconscious processes to take over and to do some of the work for you while you do other things? It's really nice.
Nice. I like that. It sounds like, going back to something you said earlier, it sounds like one of the number one things that people can do to get themselves into that flow state where they're able to be creative and they're able to work at a more productive rate is reduce stress and overwhelm. Just reduce that level of stress so you're not in that panicked mode that does not have creativity in it. One thing I'm thinking, it sounds like giving it some time to sort of sink in helps. Taking a few different passes at smaller intervals of time helps. I'm wondering, how does somebody who is currently overloaded with clients or maybe behind on their notes for clients and other things they have to do, how do they reduce that stress and how do they make that time for that gestation period, for that all to sink in?
Yeah. This is where I think processes are really important. And it can be very hard, especially when you're stressed and when you feel like you're busy, you feel like you don't have the time to focus on processes. And I think one of the reasons that is that we place way too high a bar on our ability to problem solve on the fly in a stressed state. And I personally use something that I call the sloppy operating procedure. Anybody, you might have in your business's standard operating procedures, right? These are documents that show step by step how to do certain tasks or processes. Well, when it comes to something that's maybe a little bit more abstract, a little bit more variable in input and output, we'll just take this as an example, like taking notes or processing notes after a therapy session, for example. The key word here is sloppy, is that gives you permission to place a lower bar on this process that you're creating. And so this is something that I do myself in my business. Like I said, I have a podcast. And so as I will be writing a script, I'll open up a text file or a file in my note-taking system where I keep my processes. And I'll just write extremely sloppy what I did. And I might even put it in brackets and say, okay, I did this. I needed to know what was in the conversation in order to write this script. And that was hard for me because I hadn't listened to it. And so I had to sit and listen to it. Maybe I should listen to it in advance. Boom, there you go. I just had an insight that I wouldn't have had if I had expected to create a standard operating procedure for this thing. Because again, it's this sort of hairy process that you don't really have down. And so what I would do then is just every time I do that, return to the sloppy operating procedure document and review what I've written, and then ask myself as I'm working on the thing, okay, is this process working? And maybe sometimes you're in a hurry, you're stressed, you can't improve your sloppy operating procedure. That's fine. Just open it up. And over time, just naturally, you start to improve that process, and you start to find places where you could do it more efficiently. I mean, I do this with like my morning routine, even, where if you just sit down and actually, I mean, you don't necessarily need to do this, but if you sit down and actually just write the exact steps of your morning routine, okay, like when I take the supplements, where do I get the glass of water? Where are the supplements kept? When do I brush my teeth? Do I do it before or after I shower? What order do I do these things? If you just like write down the steps, you start to discover that, oh, there's these sort of inefficiencies that you can easily change. I forgot my spoon, and I had sat down and I was trying to eat my cereal without a spoon. So I had to get up and I had to go get the spoon. Like, we don't even notice these things. We just do these things very often. And it's quite wasteful, not just in time, but in our energy. And so it's surprisingly, and it seems too simple to even matter, to follow these steps, like write them down and then like follow them one by one. Before I set up for this conversation, I have a Google Keep checklist for how to set up my office for a video interview. And I just go down the list on that checklist and I make sure everything is checked off. Even if I think that I know how to do it, I go through checklist. I usually find something that I would have forgotten. And it makes the process go easier. And also your brain starts to learn the patterns. There's a great book, Your Brain at Work, by a guy named David Rock. And he is a neuroscientist who talks about what's going on in your brain when doing different types of work. And he was talking about a study where they had people type in keys that they showed on the screen, like type this key and that key and this key and that key. And if they created a pattern in those keys, then through repetition, those people were able to do those patterns faster. They were able to type in the keys faster. And they weren't even aware there was a pattern, but there was. The pattern was complex enough they weren't able they weren't aware of it, but they were able to do the things faster. It got programmed into the, what was it? I forget which part of the brain it was, but they were able to just do those things faster. And that's what you find when you start looking at these processes, when you start creating processes, is you're able to do things with less mental energy. You don't get as fatigued. And then you start to find ways to manage that energy, to do it easier. So maybe the notes after your sessions, you have like one pass where you do very, very rough, but then you have a different time of the week, maybe, where you go through all of them and you just edit all of them. And again, I'm not sure how the practice works. Hopefully that would actually work with whatever regulations there are, et cetera. But that's just one potential way to maybe look at what it is that you're trying to accomplish and ask yourself, do you have the mental energy to do this? And are you in the right states of mind to do this? And is there a part of this that at some other time you're going to be in the right state that you're not in it right now? And you don't have to switch those states so much. So maybe if you have one session after another, then after a session, make sure that your notes are completely perfectly edited and spelled right and make perfect sense. Like maybe that switch from listening and being empathetic to being vigilant about your spelling and punctuation like that's a leap. So maybe there's a time later on in the day or right after lunch or like even a time during the week when you're able to do that part of the process. So starting to break things up by mental state is a great way to just make sure that you're moving more efficiently. I think of it like the way that a clock has all these different gears in it, and one gear is bigger than the other, and one gear turns another, and that turns this other thing. You look at the thing, you're like, I don't know how this could possibly work, but what's going on? The second hand is moving nice and smooth, and so is the minute hand, like slower than you can actually see, and then the hour hand as well. It's all synchronized. And so you can start to get towards synchronizing these things. And one of the ways to do that is through at least like looking at processes and trusting the fact that if you think about processes, even if you aren't going to come up with a perfect process right now, over time, it's going to start to emerge.
Wow. Yeah. I love that. And I think that's really important. Yeah. To look at the different states of mind that you're in, because it can be tough, switching back and forth into different states of mind. And I can see how that would waste a lot of mental power, just switching gears like that. I also want to you touched on something very key and very, very important that I want to make sure that everyone heard, which is the power of having a process for many things, but especially for your morning routine. I've been doing a process in the morning for so long that I actually forgot that that's not like what everyone does. And I've found that doing that, like, I consider my mornings the most important part of my day, because if I jump straight into, say, Facebook or email first thing in the morning, one, I'm going to go into my day stressed and on like a very high level of anxiety. I'll probably get sucked into something that needs my attention. And before I know it, the first hour of my morning is gone. Yeah. I'm sure that's relatable for a lot of people out there, because that's tempting. Oftentimes we have our alarms on our phone. So, we wake up with the alarm, we look at the phone, and then it's over.
No.
Yeah.
This is off-grid mindfulness, awake.
Oh, nice.
What was this called? The awake mindfulness clock. And it's also a meditation timer, and it's just a battery powered
Perfect
clock. Like,
yeah, that helps.
I can't think of anything worse than using your cell phone as an alarm clock. That's the worst idea.
Yeah, I used it because I
used to do it myself.
Yeah, I like the app Sleep Cycle. It's a good app it just helps wake you up like in a range of time. So it's not like at 7 o'clock. It might be 6:30 to 7, and it actually listens to see when you're not in REM sleep. So it kind of gently wakes you up. But yeah,
even with that, like a lot of people have old devices lying around. I mean, I've accumulated a number of different iPads, and I've got certain iPads for like, I might use it as an alarm when I'm traveling or something. And this iPad's for reading, and this iPad's for watching videos, to be able to like, just say, all right, this device only does these things. Like, just because it can do everything doesn't mean that it necessarily should, because, by changing your environment, by getting yourself in contact with the device, that you can do all these different things. Like, there's this path dependency to it. It's almost like getting off on the wrong exit on the freeway when the next entrance isn't for 12 miles. And that sort of thing. So yeah, be very careful. And like you mentioned about getting to a certain states, because maybe you saw something on Facebook. This is something that you can manage throughout the day, is like, what sort of states of mind do you want to be in? For myself, at 10 o'clock, the Wi-Fi goes off, my phone goes to its charging station. I read until my eyes get heavy or whatever. And it's long form reading. I mean, I've found that that's what works for me. And I wear like orange goggles. And so like after 10 o'clock, there's a certain state that goes on there. And I found that like, especially if I go on social media, I don't sleep as well. And I don't even know, I have a theory that like part of it might actually have something to do with the closeness of the relationships of the people that you're interacting with. Like
Mm,
if I'm texting a close family member late at night, I don't feel like I have as much of the deleterious effect on the sleep as if I'm like on Twitter
mm,
typing things to the world. So for
interesting.
example, but just yeah, managing and trying to be careful about what things you don't allow to disrupt the mental state that you want to be in during certain times of the day.
Yeah, I think that's a game changer for sure. Like if the only thing people come away with is that they, set that end of the day boundary and turn off the Wi-Fi and turn off the phone, start changing into more of a slow, state of mind. And if they start their day in a more gentle way where they're practicing self-care, I like to meditate, go for a walk, and do some journaling before I check anything. I think if people can just set those boundaries, then they're going to have a huge result through the rest of their day with their energy and their ability to think and do those creative things a lot better.
Yeah, especially in these coronavirus times when a lot of people are maybe working from home for the first time. Like, okay, they don't have to physically commute to work, but have they mentally and emotionally commuted to work?
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
and can you create some kind of a separation there? And you can do that through rituals. You can do that through changing your environment. So you go outside for a walk and you walk around the block and then you get home and boom, that's your commute to work. And maybe when work is over, you do the opposite. I had a thing that I did when I was first starting out on my own, and I had just a little bedroom in San Francisco when I was working late nights where I just had a Soji screen, one of those room dividers. And I would keep it around my desk and when I wanted to work, I sort of created a little cubicle and I changed the lighting and I put on a certain aromatherapy scent and I put on certain music. So I like changed every little element that I could. But then when it was time for bed, then it was a change like change the lighting, hide the desk with the Soji screen, maybe put on a different aromatherapy scent, maybe put on different music, maybe there's no music, or maybe it's a meditation, but like creating these sort of different triggers that you can create that normally we get naturally just by changing our environment by commuting. Well, you can create those different triggers to help yourself make that mental and emotional commute.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's very, very important. And especially, like you said, during these times where people, I work from home as well, like everyone else these days, and it can be tough when you're working and relaxing in the same spaces. So I really like the idea of changing up those triggers.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we talk about your book, which I see behind you a little bit. Could you grab that for us and show us what it looks like?
Sure, if I could reach it.
It's way back there.
Yes,
I'm
there
glad
we
it wasn't
go.
like a Zoom green screen or something.
Oh yeah, that would have not worked out too well. Yeah, this is mind management, not time management. Productivity when creativity matters, and it chronicles my own journey through self experimentation, trying to optimize my own creative output, moving to Colombia to create this system, and then I share everything that I've learned along the way and a lot about how I've learned it. So there's mental states. I talk about the 7 mental states of creative work and how I um, arrange my week according to those states, because there's certain cycles that naturally happen, not just in our day, but in our weeks, in our months, in our seasons, in our years, cultural cues, things like that, that you can harness in order to, like you were saying, get a little bit more output for the effort that you do put into things. So some of it doesn't necessarily work that well, that great on in a conversation. It gets a little dense. Happy to talk about any of it, of course. But yeah, the book is doing very well, and it's coming at the right time, I think. So I'm glad.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. So everyone watching can check out David's book on Amazon.
But yeah, ebook, you can get any of the ebook stores. You can go to your brick and mortar store, which I would encourage you to do, and you can order from there as well. But yeah, you can find it everywhere.
Excellent. We'll make sure to include a link to that in the show notes. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us today. Really appreciate it.
Dan, thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Likewise. And to everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you will take what you learned today and apply something, just maybe one of those small little things you can do, like have a morning routine, an evening routine. The aromatherapy thing I think is really cool. I'm definitely excited to try that out and, put it into action, see what works, test it out. Sounds like that's how David made it work for himself. So just see what fits. So with that said, we're going to wrap it up. It was great being here with you all today, and I look forward to the next time. All right. I'm Dan Pierce. This has been Mentally Fit.